When we talk about Canadian media, the conversation almost always comes back to one question. What makes something Canadian? It's not just about where it was made or who made it. Canadian identity in media is something way more subtle. It's shaped by cultural policies that actively decide what kind of story gets told and who gets to tell them and how. My argument is this: Canadian cultural policies don't just fund media, they create the conditions for storytelling that is quieter, more complex, and more diverse than what dominates mainstream global media. You can see this across 4 different texts: Drake's Headlines, Adam Egoyan's The Sweet Hereafter, Just Rain's Late Bloomer, and Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace. Each of these works is shaped by policy, but more importantly, each one uses that space to say something that what Canadians' identity actually looks like, and it's never simple. The first text is Drake's 2011 song Headlines. It might seem like an unusual place to start a conversation about Canadian cultural policy, but that's exactly my point. Under the CRTC's MAPL system, a song qualifies as a Canadian content based on factors like where the artist is from and who wrote the music. Drake meets those criteria as Toronto-born artist, but what's interesting isn't that he fits the system, it's what he does with it. Headlines isn't about being Canadian. There's no flag waving, no national symbolism, but instead, Drake raps about confidence, ambition, and global recognition. The line, "I might be too strung out on compliments, overdosed on confidence," positions him as someone who doesn't need to prove himself to anyone, including the country he came from. As scholar Boutros argues, Drake complicates traditional notions of Canadian identity, particularly within hip-hop, a genre that was never historically associated with Canada. Rather than defining himself against American culture, Drake simply enters global culture on his own terms. This matters because it challenges one of the most persistent assumptions about Canadian identity, that it's defined by being quieter, more modest, more different from the United States. Drake doesn't do that. He shows that Canadian identity can be globally confident without abandoning its roots, and that cultural policy can support artists who don't redefine what Canadian looks like on a world stage. Where Drake challenges Canadian identity by being louder than expected, The Sweet Hereafter does the complete opposite, and that contrast is important. Adam Egoyan's 1997 film was supported by Telefilm Canada, which in the 1990s shifted its mandate away from commercial filmmaking and toward work that reflected distinctly Canadian values. In practice, that meant slower, more ambiguous films, less interested in satisfying the audience than in unsettling them. The Sweet Hereafter follows a small community in rural British Columbia after a school bus crash kills almost all of the town's children. But it refuses to work as a tragedy and in the traditional Hollywood sense. There's no resolution, no justice, no emotional catharsis. As Leach explains, Canadian cinema often has defined itself by rejecting the closure-driven structure of mainstream American film. And this film is a perfect example. The absence of ending isn't a flaw. It reflects a worldview where tragedy doesn't resolve neatly and where storytelling isn't responsible for making you feel better. This matters because it shows Canadian media values complexity and reflection over simple answers, and that Telefilm's funding priorities make that kind of storytelling possible. The third text, Late Bloomer, brings Canadian identity into the present and into spaces that traditional cultural policy was never designed to reach. Just Rain's web series follows a young Punjabi Canadian man navigating family expectations, relationships, and identity. It was distributed on YouTube outside the traditional broadcast system entirely, but exists within the context of Online Streaming Act or Bill C-11, which extends Canadian content requirements to online platforms and supports creators outside conventional media structures. What makes Late Bloomer significant is that it centers a South Asian Canadian experience without treating it as exotic or secondary. There are scenes where characters speak Punjabi without subtitles, a deliberate choice that tells a specific community, you are the audience. As Bambra and Fontaine argue, this kind of media challenges stereotypes and offers more authentic representation of communities historically ignored by mainstream Canadian media. This matters because it proves that Canadian media identity is multicultural, and not just in theory, but in practice. and that digital platforms are creating space for the stories the traditional system was slow to include. The final text, Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace, asks a different question entirely. Who gets to tell the truth? The novel was supported by Canadian Council for the Arts, which funded Canadian literature as a form of national cultural development. It's based on the real story of Grace Marks, a 19th century Irish immigrant convicted of murder, but Atwood never resolves whether she's guilty. As Stales explains, the novel uses historic graphic metification to question how history is constructed and who has the authority to tell it. This matters because it reflects how something central to Canadian storytelling, a skepticism toward fixed truth and official history that policy-supported literature has long made space for. Across all four texts, the pattern is the same. Canadian media doesn't define identity through loud nationalism or simple answers. It defines itself through complexity, resistance, and the inclusion of voices that dominant media has ignored. Cultural policies such as MAPL, Telefilm, the Canadian Council, Bill C-11 don't just keep Canadian content alive, they shape the kind of content that gets made. Canadian identity isn't fixed. It's constructed, contested, and constantly evolving. And the best Canadian media leans into that and says something genuine about what Canada is and what is still becoming.